Hello, everyone. Thank you for listening in on this webinar about veterans, military, and residency in Washington State. This webinar was recorded on July 31st, 2020. My name is Gail Wooten, and I'm the Associate Director of Policy and Planning at the Washington Student Achievement Council. One of my policy areas is residency for tuition purposes, but I also work on undocumented and immigrant students, as well as transfer between the 2- and 4-year institutions. The Student Achievement Council is a state agency in Olympia whose mission is to increase the number of Washingtonians earning post-secondary credentials. As part of this work, we are responsible for the laws related to in-state tuition, and we also manage our state financial aid programs, which include the Washington College Grant and State Work Study. After the 2020 legislative session earlier this year, there are now 30 ways to get resident tuition. Most of the 30 are for veteran and military affiliated students. I will be explaining all the ways that veterans, active duty military, and dependents can qualify for resident tuition over the majority of this presentation. The first group of students are current military members. It includes active duty military stationed in Washington or who live in Washington but are stationed in an Oregon county on the Washington border. The military members' permanent change of station orders tells you which state they are stationed in. This group also includes members of the Washington National Guard. Note that National Guard members do not need to be on active duty, unlike the others that are stationed in Washington or an Oregon border county. And finally, it also includes military members who are stationed out of state but entered as a Washington resident. As long as they do not give up their Washington domicile, they can be considered a resident student. The last option I mentioned requires an understanding of two concepts, home of record and the state of legal residence. The home of record is where the person entered the military, and it rarely changes except for unusual circumstances like a mistake. The state of legal residence is considered the person's permanent home, like a domicile. It is essentially the state where they pay taxes, so there are a lot of military members who change their state of legal residence to Washington if they ever get stationed here because we don't have income tax. Similar states where that happens are Texas and Florida. Some of the documents you can use to figure out these two components are enlistment documents and their LES, or their which is their leave and earnings statement. The DD4 at the top is the enlistment document, and it has the home of record highlighted in yellow. Separation orders also include the home of record, and I'm sure there are other documents as well. The leave and earnings statement, or LES, which is basically a pay stub, shows the state of legal residence through the state taxes box. So in this case, you can see that the students or the military members' tax state is Texas. In this example, if the student's home of record was Spokane, for example, they would not qualify under the law that gives residency to a military member stationed out of state because they now have a Texas domicile. So you would want both of those states to line up. The next group to cover are dependents of people who are currently serving in the military. Dependents include spouses, domestic partners, and children. Dependents have a military ID, so you know that they are a dependent. In most cases, children are between 18 and 26, and they can be married. The most common group are dependents of active duty stationed in Washington or dependents of a Washington National Guard member. Again, the Guard member does not have to be on active duty. The dependents in these situations do not have to live in Washington, but there's a third group that does. These are dependents of active duty members who are stationed in Oregon in a county on the Washington border, and they are living in Washington. So in this case, both the dependent and the military member have to live in Washington. The first two don't require that the student or the dependent live in Washington, but the last one does. Also, for these three types of folks, if the military member is stationed out of state or out of Oregon, as the case may be, the student can continue to be enrolled as a resident student as long as they stay continuously enrolled. And this year, a new law passed that includes that they can stay a resident student as long as they were admitted before the person was restationed, even if school hasn't started. So in this case, it only applies to the school that the student ends up enrolling in. So if they get admitted to a school, the person gets stationed out of state, and they enroll in that same school, they get to keep resident tuition. If they enroll in another school, then it doesn't apply. Here's an example of a military ID. It includes the name of the military member under the sponsor section, and it also includes an expiration date. If it's expired, then the 3 ways I mentioned above would not apply for those students. Another group of military dependents are those who are dependents of someone who is stationed out of state but entered service as a Washington resident and did not give up their domicile. In this case, you would have to look at the military member's documentation, just like I explained a few slides ago. The dependent in this situation can live anywhere. And finally, a newer category of resident students are those who are eligible for post 9/11 GI Bill benefits from someone who is currently serving. Both the student and the active duty person can live anywhere, and the student does not have to be using the benefits. They only have to show that they are eligible. The way to show eligibility is through a certificate of eligibility as shown on the next slide. So I've highlighted the area that shows the expiration date. So just like the military ID, you want to check expiration here. The next group is veteran students. Starting in 2014, veteran students who can show that they are eligible for VA educational benefits like the GI Bill, again, they don't have to be actively using them, and enter school within 3 years of separation can get resident tuition. A new Washington law extends this benefit to people who are on what is called terminal leave, meaning they are technically finished with their service, but they haven't been fully released yet because they're using up their leave, so they are not considered officially a veteran. In the case of someone on terminal leave, the 3-year requirement does not apply to them because they have not been yet released. So this is usually in the case of someone who the beginning of school kind of falls right smack dab in between them finishing up their service and actually getting veteran status. So I hope this does help some students. The veteran in this case, or the terminal leave military member, has to show that they had at least 90 days of active duty service and that they separated with any period of honorable service. They do not have to be on active duty at the time of discharge. You'll want to use the DD 214 to see when they discharged, what kind of discharge it was, and how many days they served in active duty. And unlike the federal law called the Choice Act that this law was built on, Washington's law does not require that the student live in Washington. Finally, the student keeps their residency as long as they stay continuously enrolled, no matter how long it's been since they separated from the military. So as long as they enroll, even if it's like 1 day before their 3rd year of separation, they get resident tuition, and as long as they stay enrolled, that resident tuition doesn't go away. Students this year. There are 2 more types of veterans who get resident tuition. The first is those who are entitled to Chapter 31 VOC rehab benefits. Again, they don't need to be using the benefits or be living in Washington. They also don't have any time limitations, unlike the previous slide. Another law that was passed this year allows veterans who are discharged due to sexual orientation or gender identity to get resident tuition. These students also do not need to live in Washington. In the few discussions I've had about this law, I'm not sure how you would know if a person was discharged for their sexual orientation. I think it is rare to see that exact reason on a DD 214. So please let me know if you ever come across this one. Our final category is dependents of veterans. Again, dependents include spouses and children. This law is very similar to the one for vets that requires them to enroll within 3 years of discharge. In this case, everything is the same except that the dependent has to show that they are the one eligible for VA educational benefits and that they are the one who enrolls within 3 years of the vet's discharge. Typically, the educational benefits you would see here would be GI Bill, but it could also include DEA, which is the Dependents Educational Assistance Program. In this option, neither the student nor the vet have to live in Washington. And the continuous enrollment rule also applies here. If the student enrolls before the 3-year time period, they keep their residency as long as they are continuously enrolled, regardless of how long it's been since the vet was discharged. Another new law passed this year that allows dependents who are not eligible or receiving VA educational benefits to qualify for resident tuition. In this case, they have to show that the veteran had at least 10 years of honorable service versus any time period like the other law. The other requirements, such as 90 days of active duty and enrolling within 3 years of separation, are the same. Neither the student nor the vet have to live in Washington. Unfortunately, this law does not give resident tuition to a veteran who meets these requirements. My guess is that the legislature assumed that the veteran in this situation would be using the GI Bill, but that's just a guess. Washington laws also support dependents of someone who died in the line of duty as long as they can show that they are eligible for either the Frye Scholarship or DEA. If they are eligible for DEA, it must be due to the death of the service member, not due to a disability. We included other VA educational benefits in case there are benefits out there that dependents would get in the case of a service member dying in the line of duty. This law does not require any time period in which the student must enroll, nor does it require any length of active duty service. It also does not require the student to live in Washington. In addition to residency, our state laws also support some tuition waivers for veterans and their dependents. There are two primary waivers. One is permissive. It allows public colleges and universities to waive tuition and fees for a veteran as long as they have a Washington domicile, and it doesn't matter how long they had that domicile. The other requires that tuition and fees are waived for a child or spouse of someone who is 100% disabled, POW, MIA, or deceased as a result of military service. In this case, all parties involved must have a Washington domicile. There are more details about these waivers, but for more information, you will need to talk to your institution, as this is not one of the areas of the law that WASAC manages. The legislature also passed a law this year that created a National Guard grant. WASAC is managing this grant and it will be available for the fall. More information, including an application, which will be ready soon, is at wasac.wa.gov/national-guard. Even though that was a long list of ways that veterans, military members, and their dependents can get residency, there are still some people in those categories who don't qualify. So if this happens to you, be sure to remember to check to see if they meet one of the more typical ways to get residency. Those include showing that they've had a domicile for at least a year, or maybe even showing that they've lived here for 3 years and then graduated from high school here. In fact, you should always check this because it would mean that they may be more likely to be eligible for state financial aid programs. The other part of the law to remember is that military members who never gave up their Washington domicile have a year to be considered a Washington resident. So if someone enlists as a Washington resident, keeps their residency, keeps their domicile, everything stays Washington, they have a year to get back here and still get resident tuition. So I just wanted to share one thing about state financial aid and the students that I've mentioned previously. So if a student is a resident through one of the many ways I just mentioned, if that's the only way they are getting resident status, then they might be eligible for some state aid, specifically state work study, but they won't be eligible, or sorry, they won't meet residency requirements for Washington College Grant or College Bound Scholarship. However, if you have someone who meets one of the typical ways of getting residency, like I mentioned before, like domicile, then they may be eligible for any state aid program, depending on how they qualified. So this means you might have someone who meets residency requirements for Washington College Grant. And if they meet the other requirements for Washington College Grant, then they could get that aid. So you want to make sure that you're checking for that, which is actually the first takeaway that I have on our final slide. So first, check to see if a student, just because they're connected to the military in some way, doesn't mean that that's the way they have to get residency. I see these ways that I've listed here as the student's second chance to get residency, especially if they don't meet it through one of the normal ways. As you can see, there's lots of new ways to qualify for residency. I don't anticipate them affecting a large population of students, but you never know, there might be a few people that it helps. Remember that there's lots of different types of documentation, and pay attention to expiration dates. Those are important. And then also just remember that many of our options don't require the student to live in the state. And the ones that do require living in the state don't mean that the student has to have an official domicile. It just means that they have to be physically present here. So, end of the presentation. I hope it was helpful for you. And if you have any questions at all, here's my email. And I hope you all have a great day.